Thank you for having me.
And I would love it if you could just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Em. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a non binary disabled queer person. And I'm going to chat a little bit with my experience with social distancing, both before the onset of COVID in the United States and right now with the current pandemic and kind of what that looks like as a disabled queer polyamorous person.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I really, really appreciate your perspective. Insofar as the social distancing is concerned, you were doing that before it was cool. So can you tell me a little bit about what it looked like pre-COVID?
Yeah. So I'm kind of a fun double, triple whammy as far as social distancing and risk of being around people. I am immunocompromised, so I don't produce the antibodies that most people do that fight off certain illnesses. I'm also on immunosuppressants for an autoimmune disorder, so my immune system that I do have is naturally weakened. And I have a disorder that causes a lot of allergies and reactions to things like perfumes, chemicals, cleaners, things like that. So I have always, or at least for the last 5 years, engaged in some level of social distancing. For me, that looks like limiting where I'm going and how many people I'm around, especially during flu season. So unfortunately, COVID has come right at the end of when I would normally be kind of loosening up my social distancing. But some of the things that I normally do, I know a lot of people are adapting to life wearing paper masks. They suck. I wear N99s most of the time, which are similar to the N95 masks that medical providers are wearing right now, but they are cloth and they're reusable. Um, so I wear those a lot of the time, and then a lot of the precautions that people are adapting to right now, um, staying 6 feet apart, not seeing a lot of people, and kind of keeping track of how people are feeling. Those texts that you might be sending if you're starting to widen your circles a little bit, checking in, like, "Hey, how are you feeling? Are you running fever?" Things like that are all just kind of normal parts of my life and a lot of other disabled folks' lives. I'm really lucky. I still get to go to school as long as I mask and I'm being super careful. And I'm still able to work. My job has been super, super awesome as far as giving PTO and flexibility around social distancing and health stuff.
That's awesome. How did you navigate that with your job? Sorry, I'm going off script already.
No, you're fine. So I'm visibly disabled. There is no way for me to show up to a job interview and pass as able-bodied. So I've had to be really, really creative about where I go to look for employment. I have two jobs right now. I have one at a research center that researches sex. They're called the Kinsey Institute. They're one of the big sex research
Oh,
centers.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I've been super, super lucky. And I was just super upfront with them. I showed up to my interview in my wheelchair with my service dog and a feeding tube, and was just very, very upfront about, hey, this is a part of my life. And I think it will be a really great thing for me to be able to bring to the table as far as research that we do. So with that job, that's kind of how I handled it. Kinsey is known for liking diversity and being very out there. So I've been very lucky to be able to be out as disabled and queer and not monogamous. In the other job that I work with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Um, a lot of the sites that I work are actually high medical acuity sites. Um, so I work with a lot of other folks that are immunocompromised and disabled and high risk and use mobility aids. So it hasn't really been an issue at all there because a lot of the sites that we work, we've actually paired me with clients that have similar limitations because I'm going to be a lot more careful than with them than most staff would be.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I love your point about bringing so much to the table with that. I think that's so true. With regards to what things look like now with the pandemic, as opposed to what your normal social distancing and care for yourself looked like, how are things different for you?
So there have been a lot of shifts over the last month or so. I started social distancing about 2 weeks before most folks did, so I'm past the 1 month mark at this point. So that was a big shift. And for me, social distancing meant no outside contact. My roommate also works with folks with disabilities and is an essential worker. I put in for FMLA, so medical leave. Um, and moved. I moved into a living situation where we are totally self isolated. There is no one in, there is no one out. I don't have any access to outside medical care. So normally I get labs drawn. I have a port. So I get labs drawn from a nurse that comes in every week. I've switched to doing all of that kind of stuff myself at my house. So there's been an aspect of medical training. I was super lucky and was already accessing my port and dealing with all of that beforehand. Um, I've had a lot of friends who have had to learn how to access their port in the middle of all of this, which is just super stressful, and have been super lucky around that. Um, and I've been really, really lucky to be able to stay 100% self isolated here because there's a really awesome mutual aid network that is super active on Facebook here locally. So I'm able to post on there what I need, what I'm looking for, what kind of support I need as far as people getting groceries or going to the bank or running errands or coming and running my dog for me. And I can post on there, and people have been really, really amazing as far as responding to that, to be able to come in and support me and have that community support. Because I am stubborn and don't use home health aides or anything like that. So I'm usually completely independent. So there's been a huge shift around needing to ask for a lot more help and support than I usually do.
Yeah, I can only imagine. One, I love that you have that aid network, and I love that you're able to access it during this time, and I love that you're asking for help. I just love so many things about that.
Mutual
But
aid
I
networks
imagine
are
sorry,
awesome.
go ahead.
Sorry, mutual aid networks are super awesome. A lot of leftist communities have run them for a really long time, and it's been super exciting to see them kind of enter the mainstream with all of this.
Yeah, that's so great. I imagine though that if you've been isolating, self-isolating totally 100% for the last month, that's gets pretty lonely.
Yeah. Um, so I've been, I guess, lucky. I'm used to spending a lot of time in my house. I'm used to interacting with a lot of folks that are either homebound or bedbound. And there's a lot of discussion within the disability community about kind of navigating this and how we cope with this. I found it super interesting. I've seen a lot of news articles here lately about like 5 easy ways to cope with social distancing and things like that. And something that I'm noticing over and over again is we're talking to a lot of researchers about this, and we're talking to a lot of people who are 3 weeks into social distancing, which is great. And that experience of doing it the first time is really, really hard. And I don't want to discredit that, but I also think that there's this huge group of people that have years and decades of experience and of community experience dealing with this long term that aren't really being talked to about how we're coping with or how we've coped with these sorts of things in the past.
Yeah, I think when it comes to being an expert at this, like you are it. Like I think that's amazing. Um, I, I think it's amazing, and I'm sorry that that's part of your normal day to day. I also have to imagine it can be very challenging to watch the this kind of thing unfurl in the world around you and feel like on one hand do you feel like yeah thank goodness people finally get it but then also like hey, on the other hand hey welcome to the party, how are you navigating that?
I've had to remind myself a lot of how hard it was when I started living this way, and kind of how I coped and processed through that. I got dropped into chronic illness in a pretty weird way where I've always been chronically ill, and went in and out of flares and stable times up until right after I turned 18. And the winter after I turned 18, I got sick and haven't gotten better. It's been for almost 5 years. Um, but that summer afterwards, I spent 9 weeks in 3 months in the hospital with minimal outside contact. So just kind of reminding myself of what mental state I was in during that period and trying to give folks a lot of grace from that. I think something that I've struggled with a lot, and I've talked to a lot of other disabled folks a lot about. One of the biggest frustrations not being the fact that folks are struggling with this. We understand that being really, really challenging thing to go through. The thing that catches a lot of us and a lot of us are struggling with is the fact that society as a whole is modifying um, and becoming accessible to folks who are housebound because it's a need now because able-bodied folks no longer have the ability to leave their homes for jobs or groceries or things like that. So we're seeing a lot of these really amazing systems that the disability community has tried to implement or has implemented and has gotten a lot of shame around being put in place and that being a really hard thing. I have a friend who left college several years ago, a graduate program, because she was no longer able to attend in person, and her university told her that it is impossible to pursue a PhD online at their program. They have since switched and they are doing their entire semester for their graduate students online. Um, so it's really hard to watch these things that we have given up and have been told would be impossible for us to do now becoming magically possible in a matter of days or weeks because suddenly there isn't any other option. But there hasn't ever been another option for us, and we were just told that we had to deal with it. So that's been a really, really hard thing, I think, for a lot of folks to cope with.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. Thanks so much for sharing that. Hopefully, that now that these systems have been put in place, people have less, institutions have less of a leg to stand on. You're like, hello, you existed this entire time all online. So I know that
Uh,
it's
I,
possible.
I think there's a lot of um, hope and anxiety in the disability community around that because we do have proof that these systems have always existed. And we are pretty much always told that it's impossible once it's no longer possible for the majority. So think of like snow days and working from home in school. So like we've always known that this was a possibility. This will be the longest time that we've seen it be a possibility, but it's not like this is the first time that remote work has been possible, and still we're being told that remote work is impossible for companies in the same areas.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Um, how have you when you were first going through kind of the transition more to being by yourself based on your medical needs, how what strategies have you learned to cope with that that might be helpful to folks now?
Okay. I think there are a lot of different things, and it kind of just depends on your personality. And a lot of it is going to be trial and error. For me, things that have been super, super helpful are establishing routines. Not so much time bound routines. I really, really struggle with mornings a lot of the time, both from a chronic illness standpoint and like I'm in my 20s. I hate mornings. I'm nocturnal. Um, but I write out a list of the things that I'm going to do in a day and the order in which I'm going to do them right before I go to bed. Um, and then I'm able to get up and I can spend that first hour when I'm still half asleep just going straight down my checklist. And it prevents that whole being awake for 4 hours and watching Netflix episodes back to back. Um, that tends to happen for me if I don't know what I'm going to do with the day. So having some sort of plan, but giving myself a lot of grace and wiggle room to sleep in or to skip something or just have stuff come up. Other things that are super helpful or have been super helpful for me are video chats, obviously, and scheduling those. I think a lot of people are used to being able to have social interactions where they decide, hey, I want to go out to a bar tonight. I'm going to meet people. I'm going to talk to people. And while it's super, super awesome if you have the ability to go to a bar, if you are having to coordinate something like a Zoom call or FaceTime, I've found that it's not often super easy to just randomly set those up. If you run in a circle of extroverts, that might be different. I run around with a lot of super introverted academics. So planning those things out and making sure that I have some sort of FaceTime or Zoom call or something every like 2 or 3 days, um, and going into a week knowing that has been super helpful. Um, and then social media platforms and utilizing them in ways that I don't usually, or people don't usually utilize them. I really like Facebook groups. It's something that's used a lot in the chronic illness community because you can find people that you know have something in common with you. Um, so instead of just going into, I really struggle with like the location bound Facebook groups. So like I live in a city called Bloomington. I wouldn't want to go into a Bloomington Facebook group. I don't have enough in common with those people. Now, if you put me into like a queer group or a poetry group or things like that, I know that there's something in common. So finding ways to connect with new people who are just as bored as you are, because I guarantee if someone is on an online Facebook group for poetry, um, they're probably fairly bored. Speaking as someone who's in several of those groups. Um, and so finding ways to connect with people that way, if you have never used Twitter or Instagram, or there's one of these major platforms that you've never tried, it might be a really good time to get on and just tinker around and see if you can meet new folks that way. Because I think a lot of people now are really, really bored and are looking for those connections. And I think a lot of us have ourselves tricked into thinking that we're very isolated. I see that a lot in the disability community where especially folks that are completely housebound or completely bedbound assume that they're the only ones having those feelings or in those situations. So connecting with people who have a shared interest and are going through a shared experience is super, super helpful if you're struggling feeling isolated or super lonely.
Yeah, I think people have what something that is interesting I think about this pandemic is that people realize, right, that I think a little bit more maybe that they're not alone. They understand that probably everyone brings different issues to the table and everyone's situation is uniquely different, but the pandemic is impacting everybody. Um and now that we've been in it for a couple of weeks for some period of time, what I have been seeing and noticing in myself is like, so I realize that it's impactful and that it is heavy and it has weight. But then what do I do with that information? Like, how do I give myself grace? How do folks like deal with any type of maybe like feelings of depression or like just mood changes that they're not normally used to? Of course, we always talk about like, please find a behavioral health provider. There are plenty of people doing telehealth services, which is super, super helpful and so necessary. But I would love to hear any other thoughts you have on that.
As far as like coping with mental illness or mental health stuff around this.
Yeah, mental health stuff, mood changes. Yeah, I think that's great.
Um, so there are a couple of things that I um, know, at least for myself, to be super true as far as being more isolated and coping with my mood. One thing that I'm super mindful of is sunshine. I know a lot of folks that I've talked to who are not used to this have naturally gravitated to being very nocturnal, which is fine. If that's what works best for your sleep schedule, then 100% do that. But I would strongly encourage you, even if you are nocturnal, to be getting up for an hour or two whenever the peak sunlight in your house or where you live is, um, because that is something that can really, really throw your body. Keeping a sleep schedule of some sort is something that I personally struggle with. Um, so it's hard for me to be able to say that that's something that people should do. But I also know that I feel a lot better when I have a sleep schedule. So, like, take that with a grain of salt, I guess. Um, and then other super little things like getting up and putting on some sort of different clothes than I slept in is something that really helps me with my depression. Even if I'm changing from nighttime pajamas into daytime pajamas, I'm still changing my clothes, brushing my teeth, kind of having that pick me up. Um, and then not canceling therapy. I know a lot of people are really struggling with the transition to telehealth, especially for psychiatric care. I know a lot of therapists are struggling with it if that's not a platform they're familiar with. Um, and I know a lot of people are super hesitant if they have a shitty appointment. I get that it's expensive for a lot of people to pursue mental health care, but also giving yourself and giving your therapist grace um, to try it for a couple of weeks before you say, this is not a thing that's going to work for me. And if video conferencing isn't going to work for you and your therapist, I know some disabled folks that use text or phone calls or other platforms. If you just aren't comfortable with video chat, it might be worth chatting with your therapist if, hey, can we text? I'm a lot more comfortable with that than I'm with video chat, and just trying to find, or emailing them, trying to find something that works for you so that you're not suspending mental health care in a time where people really, really need to be accessing mental health care services.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and it is a good point that telehealth is a new platform for a lot of people, and you're totally right that a lot of therapists, while they can do it, are trying to figure out, like, which way is up in regards to it, not necessarily even the technical pieces, just, like, they are lacking it's just different. It's
Yeah.
so different for them, and so knowing that, like, shit's gonna be a little awkward for a while, and that doesn't mean that it can't be helpful, and it doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile in the longer term when we're talking about the amount of time that this has gone on and is going to continue to go on, so I think that's great. Um, do you find that when you have to spend more time at home, that any physical pain that you normally experience is any different, or is it about the same for you all the time?
That's a really good question. Um, it's kind of all over the place. So I have multiple health conditions, and it kind of depends on the disorder. As far as the reactivity, I have not epied at all since I have been self isolated because I can completely control the environment I'm in. That is not something I can do pretty much anywhere else. You can't go to a classroom of college students and tell them, hey, so no highly scented body washes, like no highly scented deodorant, no perfume. You can't do that. And I would never expect any space to do that. But at home, I'm able to control that. So, in that sense, I'm actually feeling a lot better being home. Um, Things that I am super mindful of. I don't use my wheelchair as much when I'm at home because it's my space and I feel pretty comfortable as far as like falling or sitting on the floor or things like that. And so I do tend to struggle with more pain and more fatigue just because I'm not using my aids as much. So pushing myself to remember to use my aids or I will not feel great tomorrow. Can sometimes be a harder thing versus if I'm at school, I use my chair because that's my only option. So kind of balancing those types of things. I'm super mindful of getting up and moving and not staying in bed all day because I have found that for me that does increase pain, and I'm super super lucky and privileged to not be bedbound. And that has never been my experience, even when I've been super, super sick. Uh, I've always been able to get up and move somewhere somehow using various mobility aids. And there are folks who are bedbound who I give huge props to coping with a whole different set of issues that I can't speak to as far as coping with that.
Yeah, totally. Um, do you have any tips or I know you mentioned that you're stubborn. I also would describe myself using such a word. How did you learn or how do you tap into your ability to give yourself grace?
So for me, visual reminders are super, super great and helpful. I'm not at my house right now, like my normal house, but my apartment where I live has a lot of sticky notes that have clear box tape over them, just on various surfaces. So, like my bedroom door says, "Remember your braces," because I hate wearing um, my joint braces, and if I'm walking that day, I need to do that. And it's just those visual reminders of like, hey, remember that this is a thing. And then another thing that's super helpful for me is I check in with folks in my life, my partners, my sweeties, my friends, about if they're willing to check in with me and hold me accountable. Because when it's just me being stubborn for myself, I guess, that's a lot harder to not have to challenge or push back on than if someone asks me, like, hey, are you using your chair today? Hey, have you taken your PRN meds? And if you haven't, do you need to take those? PRNs are like optional meds. Um, and just kind of having people that I know genuinely care about me checking in about, am I giving myself grace? Am I doing um, the things that I need to really be taking care of myself, both now and just in general. So I have several people that we kind of hold ourselves accountable and check in about those types of things because sometimes it's easier to just talk that through with someone. I can say to myself, like, oh, I'm just skipping my PRN today and just toss it back in the bucket, not thinking about it so much. But if someone sits down and asks me, like, hey, how's your pain today? Do you need to take this med? And I say no, but then they hear me 25 minutes later complaining about, I feel like crap. Having people in my life that are willing to push back on that when I'm not giving myself grace, because sometimes it can be really hard um, to give yourself grace without that kind of prompting.
Totally. I have been well, I've been thinking about it from my own mental health perspective. I run at full speed all the time. I am high achieving. I'm a little high strung. And all self-identified and everyone else identified as well. So what has been really interesting is recognizing that during this period of time that is not going to serve me, and maybe that this is an opportunity and an invitation to do some work around that. And I also have people in my life that have kind of picked up on it and said, like, hey, what have you done for your heart today? And also, like, what are you doing to take care of yourself today? And how is your mental health today? And what have you done in that regard today? And that if I like to think of myself as being very self-reflective and like, oh yeah, I would get it, except there have been many times.
I work in psych and I don't get it most of the time. I can see when I'm doing case management with people, I'm like, oh God, take a break. But I
Mhm.
could be doing the exact same schedule and be like, I'm failing. I'm not doing enough.
Oh, 100%, right? Like, I see people all the time who are also high achieving, high anxiety folks who have a lot of physical pain, and also, like, it comes with a lot of emotional weight. And all the time I tell people, like, you don't have to do everything at once. And, like, you have to figure out a way to take care of yourself. And if you don't have your health, what do you have? Um, and I know that that can be complicated,
Yeah,
and not minimizing how and not and I don't actually mean that the way I said it. What I mean is that how can you best support yourself and
yeah,
utilize the health that you do have and whatever that looks like.
yeah.
So yeah, super interesting, and I'm grateful for my friends. And it's funny because sometimes they'll say, oh, how are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm busy, and like blah blah blah. They're like, no no, how are
There's
you?
yeah. I think another thing that has helped me a lot is I'm a very my family calls me a capital A type personality. So like A type to the extreme. I really like calendars and schedules, like I've mentioned, but physically writing into my Google Calendar or my plan for the day, rest 30 minutes and not letting myself do anything else on that checklist. I can do whatever I want. I just can't do any of the things I was supposed to do that day. Um, and physically writing that out, because I think for a lot of people, we assume or grew up with this mentality of work first and then play, or homework first and then play, or whatever the wording was used growing up. And I think a lot of us internalize that. And while I think that it's a super helpful model for elementary schoolers, I think as we become adults and we enter this phase where there isn't ever a really clear definitive stop point in our to-do lists, that it's important to add rest as a part of our to-do lists, so that we're actually taking that time. And for me, having that blocked off in red on my Google Calendar, hey, you've got to stop for an hour. Hey, you've got to stop and not do your homework, has been super helpful.
Yeah, planning in white space. I think it's Brene Brown who says it that way. You have
Mhm.
to actually schedule it in.
Yeah.
So you mentioned being non-monogamous, and would be very interested to hear how that looked pre-COVID versus now. Is it different? Is it the same?
Um, it's different and the same. So I have a partner and two sweetheart type humans, humans that I go on dates with fairly consistently. My partner is long distance. It hasn't shifted a ton pre or post COVID. He lives in Colorado and I live in Indiana. So I usually go out to visit them every 3 months or so. We actually just had a trip postponed because I was supposed to fly out there this week. Obviously, I'm not flying anywhere in a pandemic. So in that sense, there have been little shifts, but not anything major. Um, as far as my sweethearts, one of them is local and has had COVID and passed um, through that. Um, I still haven't seen them. I will probably see them at some point once we're 100% sure that they are totally symptom free. I am way on the cautious end as far as that. But we'll eventually slowly start adding folks back, starting with folks that I am confident are the most cautious around things and kind of moving out from there. Um, I think the only major shift that I've had is as far as like casual encounters with folks. I'm not seeing anybody that I see super casually and probably won't um, for the foreseeable future. I practice relationship anarchy, so I don't um, have or want to have any control over my partners or their lives or what they do or who they see, which is awesome. And I love that. And it is also really hard and scary as far as stuff like that, like this, because I can't and don't want to tell people to not see their other humans or not do the things that they want to do. All I can do is set boundaries for myself and my interactions with them. So for me, that would look like being like, hey, if you are hanging out with people who are essential workers or who are going out, we just can't hang out. It's not safe for me. And phrasing it that way rather than making it a rule where they have to stop seeing other people because that's not the way I practice relationships or have relationships. I don't want that kind of control over my partners. And while there's a part of me that sometimes gets really sad about that because I can't, there's never a guarantee that someone will say yes. I want to prioritize you. I will do what I need to be able to see you. My partners always have the choice to say, no, I want to see these other humans, even if that means not seeing you. Um, so there is some sadness as far as navigating that kind of stuff. That's not been something that I've run into with COVID in particular yet, but it is definitely something that I know a lot of chronically ill poly people are navigating right now because it's challenging. A lot of people are talking about when they'll combine households with their partners if they're not living together, monogamous people. And for poly folks, I have 3 humans. Um, my partner has another partner. My sweetheart has another partner, and my other sweetheart has 2 other partners. If we were to combine households, that's a lot of people. Even just from a risk logistics standpoint, that's a lot of people. So that's been, I guess, an interesting part of navigating all of this is that discussions as far as combining households has been super tricky. But I think that we have a lot more tools than a lot of folks do around navigating this. My polycule has adopted and kind of shifted a model called RAC, which is Risk Aware Consensual Kink, that looks at your risks as an individual, the potential harm, the potential benefits, and acknowledges that there's no situation that's 100% risk free. It's just not how the world works. Um, and using models like that and models of super open communication to try and navigate this, I think is something that's been different than a lot of the monogamous folks that I've talked to as far as how they're navigating this. It's very much so well, I'll see my partner when it's safe. Um, and while I think that that is a super great sentiment to have, I'm also very, very realistic as a chronically ill person who has dealt with um, minimizing risk around communicable illness for quite a while. And I understand and know that if I were to use the model of I will see my people when it is safe, that I would probably live in solitary forever. And that's just not a super great way to live.
I think there's so much there that's so useful.
Right. I agree.
Um, there's so much. I just don't even know where to start. So one, I think it's super. I just want to point out to anyone who's listening, and what I heard was that you as someone who are a capital A type personality and deal with chronic illness in a way that is actually quite dangerous to your physical body a lot of the time, uh, are a relationship anarchist where you forego all control over other people.
Yeah, that's been really, really, really challenging,
Uh-huh.
for those reasons, as well as for someone who is, anxiously attached and has trauma. Um, so it's been a lot as far as navigating and trusting my humans, but it's also been a lot of, freedom and healing for me in the sense that I don't, a lot of chronically ill people that I talk to feel a lot of guilt, around, well, what if my partner is just staying because I'm sick? Um, or what if they're saying they don't really want to? That's not an anxiety I have, because I know my people are free to leave and they know that they're free to leave and they stay because they want to.
Yeah, that's awesome. A lot of married people have similar guilt. So I think that there's some like very interesting stuff in that. What can you give an example of how you might use or your adapted rack and talk kind of how you implement that?
Yeah. So this is actually something that I've worked through a lot the last couple of weeks, in trying to figure out if I was going to come out to Colorado for my trip or not, and kind of what that looked like. Um, So in RAC, you're going to look at, all of the possible risks. What are all of the possible risks that could happen? Well, I could get COVID. My partner could get COVID. Um, their nesting partner or their child could get COVID or already have it and not know that they have it because children are super spreaders. Um, so there are all of those risks. There are the risks of having to navigate a medical care system, that I am not familiar with, but is not familiar with me, which for disabled folks is really, really scary and dangerous. Um, so, like looking at all of those possible risks, and weighing those against all the possible goods. The fact that Colorado's had a lot less cases, the fact that you guys are a lot more, prepared from a healthcare system standpoint than we are, the fact that I wouldn't be self isolated when I was out there, and weighing those pros and cons and having an open discussion with everyone involved. So this wasn't just a discussion I was having by myself or between me and my partner. This was something that they were talking with their partner about, that I was talking to my medical providers about, and kind of just assessing from that standpoint what level of risk we were both willing to, assume at any given point, because it's not necessarily something that someone has to agree to. It could be me saying, "Oh, I'm super comfortable flying. That's totally fine." And my partner being, uncomfortable having someone who could have picked up COVID on an airplane in their house, because they have a kid, or me being like, "Oh, I don't want to travel right now," and them wanting me to come. So there can be that imbalance, but always making sure you're not compromising your own, um, comfort or boundaries for other people, I think is something for me that RAC has been super important in teaching, because I think that we're taught compromise a lot. And I think that compromise is great in a lot of situations. And as far as really high risk situations like kink, like sex, like a pandemic, um, compromising your boundaries is not something that I think that folks should be doing unless it is. I think it's different if they're those boundaries that are created out of anxiety or out of paranoia or aren't logically grounded. But I don't think that folks should be compromising their logical boundaries. And for me, that's another huge part of how RAC kind of plays into, navigating risk around COVID.
I think that's awesome. Do you find that as you have been using rack or maybe just throughout your experience with kink or being non-monogamous that that your relationship with intimacy and what you see as being intimate is different or the same?
Um, it's interesting. I think that my definition of things is definitely, different than a lot of folks. But it's at the same time not uncommon for folks in the disability community or the polyamorous community. So I'm navigating a long distance relationship. So as far as being comfortable, I'm seeing a lot of discussion online, right now about like how to have phone sex or how to Skype or how to talk to your partner about consent and comfort, like comfort around that kind of thing. Um, and those are all discussions that I've always had in relationships and are just kind of normal to me because there's never assumption about geographical like closeness to a partner. So unlike monogamy, if someone were to move, there isn't like a long-term partner were to move, there's never an assumption that their partners would all move with them. That would just be a whole mess of poly people moving all the time. Um, so I think as far as those types of things, there's a lot more comfort in navigating um, those types of things and how relationships are defined and viewed as being a lot more fluid and a lot more used to just communicating through a lot more anxiety and things than um, a lot of my monogamous friends do. There isn't that avoidance of conversation because there isn't room or time or energy for that.
Yeah. So I was thinking as you were speaking that I have one partner and I'm married and we're monogamous, but we did 5 years of long distance, and so all of the technological sex there is to have, I've also had those conversations about navigating it, which is interesting, and I think in some ways is actually it feels more practical and logistical and less emotional than once you get into an in-person situation that I can have found for myself that sometimes those conversations are more challenging to have. I certainly have clients tell me like, "Oh God, I could never say like I could never look my partner in the face and say that to them." So what you said was like you just can't avoid it. Do you any other tips, or is it really just like you just got to rip off the band-aid and do the thing?
Um, as far as like communicating around sex and stuff like that,
Yeah, and setting boundaries.
I think there are a lot of super helpful online resources around that right now and around exploring desires and intimacy in general. I can link you a whole bunch of stuff to
Please do that. Please
share
do
with
that.
this. And then another, hang on, oh, put two things far away. Um, I'm actually reading this right now, but anything by Clem Morgan. She writes a lot on poly and mental illness and navigating attachment and boundaries and things like that. That I think is super helpful for folks to use this as a time to really critically think about well, how am I communicating in my relationships? What kind of risks am I taking on? And using some of this self time to do a lot of self evaluation because a lot of us are avoiding processing the pandemic and things going on with that, which I totally get. It is a lot to process things as it's happening. And I think it's also important that we not emotionally shut down. And if that isn't something that you can process right now, to be picking other things to be processing and working through, even if it's not super major stuff. I think that for folks who are in a place to be able to do this, that even if you aren't processing stuff around the pandemic, that this can be a really, really great time to process other stuff.
I think that's great advice. I think without really realizing it, that's why I kind of wanted to make this series. And that I think that the pandemic has been a magnifying glass for a lot of folks in terms of issues that they might have around intimacy with themselves or with others. But like, this isn't about dealing with the pandemic. This is about figuring out what stuff you're bringing to it that is maybe being magnified right now. So I definitely think that's great advice. Um, yeah, I think that that's everything I have. Is there anything that you really wanted me to that you really want to talk about? Is there anything that you want able-bodied folks to know or to stay the same or to do differently when we go back to not social distancing?
Yeah, I actually really like that last question about what able bodied folks could do moving forward to kind of act as allies. I think something that I see being discussed a lot in the disability community right now is a lot of um, excitement that things are the way they are right now, and a lot of fear that a lot of these things are going to disappear. So there are a lot of folks doing jobs that would be really, really accessible right now. So, like therapists completely working online, or folks who work in business who are being allowed to work completely from home. Um, and I think for folks who are in a position of power or who have privilege in their workplace, leveraging that to challenge, hey, have we considered continuing offering these options even past COVID so that single parents or people who are homebound or people who are taking care of their elderly parents and have to be home all the time still have the ability to work from home. I think that that's going to be a huge thing. Um, I think working on stigma and social anxiety around disability and PPE after this is definitely something that I and a lot of folks who wear PPE outside of the pandemic are very, very anxious about. Folks who wear face masks in public have always had um, challenges. I have a lot less challenges than most folks because I am pretty visibly disabled. You're not going to go up to a visibly disabled person and tell them to take off their face mask or their gloves. You just aren't. And if you do, then you need to do some self evaluation. Um, but I know when I started wearing my N99s, I was walking full time and I had my feeding tube in and out and I didn't have a central line. And I know a lot of folks who are in that category who either have multiple chemical sensitivities or mast cell activation syndrome or asthma or things like that, who are very, very anxious about what the response to us re-entering society as people wearing PPE is going to be, and the very, very real risk that we will be ostracized or face discrimination or hate crimes or things like that because of this kind of community anxiety and fear that we have surrounding COVID. Um, so I think that it's important for folks to kind of take a second and pause if you run into someone who is wearing a face mask in 6 months after all of this has passed, to not jump into that trauma response that I think a lot of us are going to have around COVID, and not panic or freak out or ostracize that person just because of the trauma that you've internalized.
Yeah, I think that that is great advice. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for all of this. I think it was super helpful in a lot of ways. So thank you for your expertise in that. And yeah, I really appreciate you.
Yeah, so happy to help.